Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 253. This is 89 pages long, so it's a short-esque work. The Supernatural in Romantic Fiction. It's an excellent springboard into other things. Link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links to my books blogs, both Blogspot and WordPress. If you're interested in folklore, there's a whole section for it. A lot of it's like cryptozoology, there's some Arthurian legend, certainly some antiquated material. I find it fascinating. It's one of my favorite fields within the occult. Folklore and herbalism really are the two, and dream interpretation and fortunes, I'd say, in third. This particular work is not so much a coherent, flowing piece in and of itself as it is broad snippets of works correlating them together. So, for instance, you get one particular folktale from antiquity, and then this traces the derivations of the basic concept, the tropes used within that story through later times. And this happens commonly. One of the biggest things that I've done within the occult, in my practice, in the most literal, magical sense, is to look at the connection between things. Where things intersect, especially when they intersect more than a few times, I give those little bits of lore importance, and I study them in more detail, and I try to find additional connections. I find this important. This is part of the mystery traditions, especially of the Enlightenment through the Victorian era as well. If you look at like the Masons, like one of the mystery tradition sort of veins of thought there is, hey, there's this solar sort of symbology that's been universally used in all these spiritual systems going back even to pre-Christian times. This probably has importance. We're trying to display it to people symbolically to tell sort of a story for Enlightenment purposes. And I find that to be interesting and intriguing. With this work, it dwells heavily on the Arabian Nights. That's a big one. Some of the legends of King Arthur and some of the tropes used therein, because that influences certainly a lot of poetry, especially later. Shakespeare is mentioned frequently. It even mentions Edgar Allan Poe. A lot of it is about, for instance, cryptozoology, odd creatures with supernatural characteristics, and it seeks to categorize creatures that are simply unique because they're abnormal in size or something. They're physically improbable but not technically impossible, like a giant squid. A giant squid is just a squid of enormous proportions. It has no supernatural basis to it. Then you have something like a centaur. The centaur is more strictly supernatural. We can't find a biological being of an actual centaur divorced of that spiritual context. He also, and this is the funny part, the author actually lists in the preface, is talking about, well, I'm going to try to stick to like the Romantic period, like the Arthurian period stuff. I'm not going to go back too much into antiquity, but occasionally I have no choice, you know, for the story's sake. And he actually has two entire sections, one on Norse mythology, and this influences things heavily in the poetic tradition especially, and then the Hindu tradition. The Hindu tradition, of course, affects the Persian sort of Near East traditions that then seep into Europe that he's looking at the time. He doesn't delve into any of the then fully contemporary materials. However, you know, it gets close to it. Talks about Frankenstein a few times. You know, basically the underlying basis for what had become some of our horror and supernatural fiction now actually has its roots 1,000 years before. Extremely interesting story. If you're interested in folklore, the biggest use of this particular work isn't so much its content, because again, it doesn't tell any complete story for the most part. It gives a brief rundown, like Jack and the Beanstalk, some of the fairy tales, again, Arthurian legends, some of these other myths and legends throughout time. The biggest use of this is to find secondary sources. These works are invaluable for the independent occultist. If you're not getting a coursework primer of here's a list of works that you should go through for additional reading on the subject of Satan or witchcraft or something, you need to find your own. Therefore, when you can find a book that's basically a laundry list of secondary sources, oh, it's the best thing ever. Some of the best works that I've edited from are literally nothing more than I saw the title mentioned in another work. I looked it up, obtained it, and started editing the other work. In fact, the work I'm working on right now lists several other works as well from sort of the New Age Atlantean post-Blavatsky era. And actually, I'm going to seek those out as well, because it's apparently the third in a series of works by, I think, Yardley, if I remember correctly, or Farnsworth. Excellent material. I strongly recommend this if you're interested in folklore. Again, not so much for its own content as for secondary guide, and it correlates these works together, giving more of an academic rigor to them, because a lot of the folklore isn't even strictly occult. Like if you're looking at Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack and the Beanstalk in and of itself isn't particularly occult, but there are tropes in it that are, technically speaking. There are talismanic works from the Enlightenment period that talk about sort of like the idea of a goose that lays the golden egg in modified form. You think of the Black Pullet maybe as a work. Some of these other grimoires from pre-existing times actually list similar things happening. It's almost an alchemical archetype, which is actually spoken of within this work. So very fascinating stuff. Again, 89 pages. It's middling in length. It was initially full length, but amusingly, the format in works from the late 19th century, almost everything is the equivalent of double space today. So it compresses down pretty well into a modern work. This also helps reduce the cost because, of course, there's less pages to print. I think that's a wonderful thing. Remember that all of my editions are hand-edited. I don't do what some people do. Some people take a PDF scan of the initial document with all of its errors and printing problems and slap it into a PDF file, and they'll pass this off as their own work. Well, it's not. It's bullshit. The fact is Amazon should kick them all off of the site. Then I'd probably be the main supplier of occult arcana at that point, other than some of these niche publishers that do hardcover somehow through the site. I don't even know how they do that. I would love to, by the way. But again, links in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon, as well as to my books, blogs. There is other folkloric material available. This one comes highly recommended for those that are interested in studying further. That's about all. Peace out.